Hello. Today I'm going to talk about Joseph Stalin, his many victories of revolutionary transformation, and his mistakes. He had a decent amount of these as well. This video is dedicated to defending Stalin as a figure of worldwide revolutionary progressivism, but I entirely reject the idea that great men make history. Only the masses make history, and Stalin himself would have agreed with this as well. Material and cultural conditions give rise to true progressive change, nothing else. That being said, let's get into Joseph Stalin's legacy. Joseph Stalin was a dynamic and nuanced leader. He faced sabotage, both internal and external, for his entire stewardship. He had to defend himself many times, from political adversaries within the party, even. The subject of Lenin's testament was a complete falsification that called for Joseph Stalin's immediate removal as General Secretary by those who would want to take the position for themselves to control the Central Committee. Even conservative historian Stephen Kotkin believes that this was a complete falsification. The document of Lenin's testimony conveniently calls for the removal of Stalin as General Secretary and the advocacy of Trotsky, despite Lenin's strong condemnation of Trotsky's constant history of blatant opportunism, siding with the Mensheviks and only joining the Bolsheviks when it was convenient. Right-wing historian Stephen Kotkin outlines this in his book Stalin, Paradoxes of Power, 1878 to 1928. While his framing of key Soviet events relating to Stalin is obviously biased, he gives us a good understanding of what the political conditions and conspiracies entailed during Stalin's rise to power. Trotsky, fabricating this document, was instrumental to his later expulsion from the party entirely, as he and Stalin's detractors and political rivals would constantly bring it up as often as they could, leading to Stalin going in so far as to offer his role as General Secretary up during the 1920s, believing it to truly be Lenin's dictation, but this was voted down by the rest of the Central Committee, leaving him in his position of power. Stalin actually tried to resign his position a total of 4 times. This just goes to further prove the type of character Stalin had, and that he obeyed the laws of democratic centralism and anti-factionalism. If he believed he was bad for the party, he would gladly step down. Trotsky would later go as so far as to create an illegal bloc dedicated to bringing down Stalin's state, even if this left faction had to resort to means of terror to do so. Trotsky, allied with the left opposition, Bukharin and Zinoviev, would plot to take Stalin out of power. Many so-called historians in the West denounced the Moscow trials as a sham trial put up by Stalin to accuse his political enemies of supposed wrongdoings in order to get them out of the way. But this, as we'll see, is false. The Moscow trials had lots of evidence pointing to the collaboration between a Trotskyist Bukharinite Zinoviev bloc, along with other leftist faction leaders in the party. The sudden murder of Kirov would start this investigation that would discover this underground anti-Soviet bloc. A letter from Trotsky to Sedov would read as follows. My letter is evidently intended for the left opposition, in the true sense of the word, but you may show it to the informant, so that he may have an idea of how I see things. The proposal for a bloc seems to me to be completely acceptable. I must make quite clear that we are dealing with a bloc and not a fusion. My proposed declaration is evidently intended for our fraction of the left opposition, in the strict sense of the term, and not for our new allies. The opinion of the allies, according to which we should wait for the right-wingers to involve themselves more deeply, does not have my agreement. As far as our fraction is concerned, one fights repression by means of anonymity and conspiracy, not by silence. Loss of time is impermissible. From the political point of view, that would amount to leaving the field to the right-wingers. Stephen Kotkin doesn't put forth that Trotsky forged this documentation directly, but I think it would only be fair to assume so, judging that he would later resort to using means of violence to try to overthrow the Soviet government, when at first his fabricated documentation of Lenin didn't work in succeeding to overthrow Stalin. The left opposition would push this document so often and yet Stalin had such wide appeal within the party that the documentation would just be scrapped. No one cared. When means of political maneuvering don't succeed, what is left? Only violence. When Yezhov, the head of the secret police, was asked to investigate the leftist faction after the death of Kirov, he reported that he found no connection. Later, we can see that this was obfuscation, a covering of his political allies within the party. This would later lead to what would be known as the Great Purge. Trotsky, after being expelled by the party in 1927, was gone, but his faction remained. They were allowed to remain in the party because they self-criticized and supposedly denounced their factionalist views. This would later be proven false, as the entire time they had been collaborating in trying to overthrow the Soviet state and possibly ally with Nazi Germany to take state power when the time was right. The claim that Bukharin and Zinoviev and their collaborators within the state apparatus were somehow a threat to Stalin and that he needed to remove them is again false. They could have been removed in the past, and they simply were not. They self-criticized and thus were allowed to stay within the party and participate in party activities. If Stalin wanted these people removed, they would have been removed. But instead, they supposedly obeyed the party's principles and were allowed to stay. If Stalin really was so brutal and wanted to completely crush all opposition, why would he let these former Trotsky-aligned members of his party be allowed back into the party? Stalin obviously didn't view them as a threat until the conspiracy was uncovered. Only then were they viewed as a serious threat to be prosecuted and brought to justice. Otherwise, this narrative wouldn't make any sense at all. Trotsky and his faction demonstrate, no better than any other example I can think of, a naive, adventurous ideal can take you nowhere but to side with fascists. As is historically proven, Social Democrats and Trotskyists, specifically, always default on imperialist lines when pushed even slightly. Stalin himself was suspicious of the NKVD's report about several collaborators, Yakovlev and Yakovlev, and he suspected their wives of being a part of the conspiracy. But the NKVD found no proof of this, despite Stalin's assertion that they were guilty and they were let free. This also goes to show how anyone that Stalin was suspicious of wasn't just arrested and put up in a mock trial. The NKVD had evidence for these assertions, not just Stalin's own prejudice. No one can deny the atmosphere of fear and paranoia during the Great Purge. But instead of looking at this event as Stalin unjustifiably cracking down on his own people, we can view this series of events in a much more accurate and nuanced way, through the lens of dialectics. The cleansing of the bureaucracy was a good thing. It was much more top-down than something like Mao's Cultural Revolution. And because of the top-down nature of this cleansing, it is called totalitarian, whereas the Cultural Revolution might be seen as an active proletarian participatory movement. But in an honest analysis of both Mao's Cultural Revolution and Stalin's Great Purge, we can see similarities. There's vast excesses on the people, on the masses, reporting each other, looking for the counter-revolutionary, looking for foreign infiltration. This is only natural. It's a natural consequence of siege socialism. While Yezhov may have later been found guilty of excesses during this time, the state can be held responsible for letting Yezhov get away with these excesses, for letting the NKVD get away with this purging of the people. And it should be held responsible. Stalin should be held responsible. This was a vast oversight. Allowing the NKVD this type of power was a huge mistake. Yezhov, a conspirator himself, obfuscating over the obvious counter-revolutionary elements of the Soviet Union and instead directing this fear and anger towards the people itself set the Soviet Union back significantly. As soon as Yezhov himself was found guilty of these crimes against the Soviet people themselves, he was put to death. The Great Purge had come to an end. In many ways, we can compare Yezhov's NKVD to the Red Guards that the state in Mao's China used to control the Cultural Revolution and redirect all opposition against not the party, but the people themselves. Within a one-party system, everyone espousing the same ideology, it's very hard to determine who your allies and enemies are. This has been proven by history. It's much easier for counter-revolutionaries to gain traction within a proletarian party just by obfuscating their true beliefs. This is why purges of the bureaucracy is actually a necessity within democratic centralism. But to allow it to get to the excesses of both the Stalin purges and Mao's Cultural Revolution are troubling, something we should keep in mind for further socialist experimentation. The Soviet state made many mistakes that are easy to judge in hindsight, but what these people did was no doubt incredible, turning a backwards feudal nation into a powerhouse of both military, culture, and proletarian democracy. The achievements of Stalin's USSR are ingrained in history as one of the greatest achievements of mankind by far. He is a figure of internationalism and solidarity even to this day.